a couple examples I've got here is the first one. You've got an image source posting there where instead of displaying a message, it could post some kind of subject to some kind of forum that says "CERIAS sucks" and or if somebody knows of a web application that exists behind somebody's NAT wall, they could set up something where if an action is again done by GET, you've got this terminate employee thing, and it could terminate employee ID number 123. Both of those are again examples where if somebody's able to pass in an image tag into your code and then or submits that to a web application, then that's displayed to the user. Well, then the user's client then will automatically execute that. The issue here is that HTTP is kind of a pretty simple protocol. It doesn't differentiate between whether you're asking for an image or you're trying to request a script or you're trying to request some kind of static, non-binary text, ASCII document. It doesn't make any differentiation between that. So an image tag, even though it's supposed to be an image, you can request anything you want to with it, and you can do stuff like that. An SQL injection, that is it's another example of messing with input. It's manipulating the input that's sent via any method, whether it be GET or POST or it's stored in a cookie, something like that, that's passed unfiltered into an SQL query. An example here is somebody passes, normally for the login, it might get, this is a real simple example that would be done via GET. Login.php is something that processes logins to some kind of web application. As passing username equals root or whatever. And then you're just manipulating what the value of username is, you're closing you're having apostrophe there to close it, and then you're inserting another SQL statement in here, drop table users. With a lot of databases, if they allow you to do multiple statements per line, what we're showing here is that because no one's filtering what's being passed in on username, well, that just gets passed into the SQL statement. Those things, that string gets passed in, the query gets executed, and I just deleted my user table. That is extremely common, our SQL injections. Again, I'd say most of the vulnerabilities that we saw in phpBB, php nuke, I would say 78% of those were SQL injections of cross-site scripting attacks. Code injections are basically like SQL injection, but you're passing some other type of code. That might be a PHP script that gets evaluated, shell commands, things like that. The eval command, the pair XML RPC vulnerability, that was an example of a case where people were able to pass PHP script that would get evaluated by the XML RPC library and run. And so people figured out a way to manipulate the strings that get passed in, so it would pass any filtering that was on there, and it would execute the code arbitrarily. Exec and other shell calls are vulnerable to that if people don't do the proper kinds of input validation. And also things like fopen, include, and require. Anything that's working with paths on the system, it's pretty easy to manipulate those. It's where if you're taking user input and you're passing it to create, say, a path for what file to open or something to include or require, things like that, it's pretty easy to manipulate those so you can get it to display etc password or some other system file on there. These are some basic things with code injection. Both of these are working with the include statements, and where the web application is set up so it's using something that the user's passing in without doing any kind of validation, and passes that. So in the first example, they set up to include a certain page where, and the person manipulates that. So instead of using the page that the developer expected, he says, well, no, I want to get etc password off there. And because there's no checking done there, it goes ahead and includes it as text, and then that's going to be displayed back to the browser. What's worse, even worse, is the second example where if PHP's allow URL fopen is enabled, and evilscript.php on this site is just passed back as text, well, this include will just grab that off of the site, pull it in, and it'll be parsed as PHP. So then you can execute arbitrary code on it. So we're going to deal with some defense strategies here. We're going to deal with some code level defenses, filtering on the service level. When I talk about services, I'm talking about web daemons, databases, things like that. And then basically web services designs, how you set those things up to interact, and ways to deal with these kinds of things. With input, basically when you're dealing with code level stuff, for anything you just have to consider it with input consideration. That's what you have to take into account for any kind of attack. You have to think about for each one of the values you're dealing with input, what are you expecting? Are you expecting an integer? Are you expecting a particular format of string? Are you expecting one of a finite set of options? And in parentheses, I put a couple things that are ways that you deal with that. If you're looking for an integer, you can do a test to say, in PHP, you do a test with to see if it's use the isNumeric function. Because you have to, because everything that's passed in is actually going to be a string if it's passed in to the off of the input off of the get or post payload. Everything's going to be a string, so you have to use isNumeric, which actually expects a string and looks at it and says, is this a numeric string like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 0, or not? And you would look at that, because something like isInt or isInteger is going to fail every time because it's not an integer, it's a string. Again, particular format of string, you would use some kind of regex to check against that. An example might be if you're looking for a person's, if the input is supposed to be somebody's last name, where there's going to be a certain number of characters, certain characters that's going to be made up of alphabet characters, maybe a dash, maybe an apostrophe, possibly a space, but that's basically it. It shouldn't include things like a semicolon or 2 dashes or an @ symbol. Those things should not be in somebody's last name, typically. I don't know of anybody who has one. So, and one of a finite set of options, that's easy. You just you use a switch statement or some if-else kind of construct to check against those. And you have to think about how the input's going to be used. Is it going to be in an SQL query? In that case, you'd probably want to process it with a prepared statement, or you need to run it through some kind of escaping functions first. Escaping functions that are particular to the database that you're working with. If you're going to use it in a system call, well, at least in PHP, there's some functions that are specifically designed to escape stuff that's going to be used for that. Escape shell command, escape shell arg. Are you going to use it in a URI? Then you need to URL encode it. That uses special encoding that is appropriate for passing things via that. Or if it's going to be displayed to the user, you want to use something like HTML entities. Again, that's a PHP function that converts characters that are used in HTML to the entity markup, so they're displayed literally to the user and not. It doesn't say interpret it as HTML. The browser doesn't interpret it as HTML. I mean, at the essence of it, you have the real question is anything safe that you're going to get? And the answer is no. You really can't ever assume that any kind of input you're getting is safe. Anything that's coming from outside your code could be malicious. That can include things where oftentimes people don't think about this because they think, well, it's being generated by a machine, it's being generated by a computer usually, so an XML feed is going to be okay. Well, not necessarily. Somebody could easily just pass something in there. And I've seen a lot of web developers who will are very careful about checking what you say human code that comes in via get or post. They're very meticulous about checking those kinds of things, but don't check things like XML feeds that they pull down to their site and to incorporate content. That stuff you have to treat just the same way.